Hello, my name is Bronwyn Bruton and I am the director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, which is dedicated to promoting U.S. partnerships with African nations and institutions, strengthening security and bolstering African prosperity. Thank you for joining us today. It's become a cliche for journalists and politicians to conclude their remarks by declaring that we need a Marshall Plan for Africa. It sounds like a nice pro-Africa thing to say, but in fact, it's also profoundly cynical. To say that Africa needs a Marshall Plan is essentially to say that Africa is as much a wreck and a ruin as Europe in the aftermath of World War II. In a worst case scenario, it can be a polite way of saying that Africa is hopeless and there's not very much that we can do. That's possibly why Vera Songwe, head of the UN Commission for Africa, has publicly rejected the idea of a Marshall Plan for Africa, saying that efforts are better focused on trade, and particularly the creation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and not on more and more rounds of aid. She has a great point, but a growing range of very serious people, including investment expert Aubrey Ruby, former Republican Congressman David Bratt, and even internationally renowned, aid skeptic Dambisa Moyo disagree. We're here to find out why. Directing our conversation today is Mr. Gabriel Nagatu, Senior Fellow at the Africa Center and former East Africa Director General at the African Development Bank. In short, a person who knows both trade and aid. If you have a question for this remarkable panel, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you're joining us on the webinar. And if you're watching us online, please write to us at AC Africa, Twitter at AC Africa. Thanks for being here. And Mr. Gabriel Nagatu, thank you for hosting us. Over to you.
Good morning. Morning again, everyone. My name is Gabriel Nagatu, and I have the privilege of facilitating this morning's conversation. My job is easy. My job is to introduce the eminent speakers that we have lined up for you, and then to kickstart the discussion. So this morning we are joined by three distinguished panelists, and let me quickly introduce them without taking up too much of your time. The first panelist is Dr. Dambisa Moyo, a name that most of you are quite familiar with. Dr. Moyo is a preeminent thinker and a thought leader on macroeconomics, geopolitics, and technology themes. She previously worked at the World Bank and Goldman Sachs before becoming an author and international public speaker with 4 New York Times bestsellers. If you haven't read Moyo, then you haven't been following Africa. She also sits on the board of several corporations, including 3M, Chevron, and Condé Nast. Our next speaker is Dr. David Bratt. He's the Dean of Liberty University in Virginia and the School of Business. Dave is a former US congressman, having represented Virginia's 7th Congressional District from 2014 to 2019, and has consulted with the World Bank as an economist, and Dave brings a wealth of knowledge to this conversation. And the third panelist is our own Miss Aubrey Herbie. Aubrey is a senior fellow with the Africa Center, as well as the co-founder of Insider and the African Experts Network. She has consulted extensively in 25 African markets, advises senior policymakers and Fortune 500 companies on doing business in Africa. Aubrey writes regularly on US-Africa trade. So this is the team of experts we have assembled for you. So just to kickstart, I think the rapid spread of COVID-19 in Africa has upended life in the continent in ways that were never contemplated, on both the health side, the economic side, and the social and political side, and so on. And the case for a Marshall Plan type of intervention has never been greater, and the time has never been more urgent. Therefore, I'm going to ask each of my panelists, starting with you, Dr. Moyo, to give us, to take about 3 minutes to frame your thoughts on this, and then we'll start the Q&A interactive session, and then we'll subsequently take questions from the panel. So without any delay, let me hand it over to Dr. Moyo. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to join you today to really talk about an issue that is not only important, but quite urgent. I must say that it's quite regrettable that Vera Songwe is not herself on this call, because I suspect her views around the importance and the need for a Marshall Plan, quote unquote, perhaps will be much more nuanced than perhaps is being portrayed more generally in the media. To me, the argument for a short, sharp, and finite intervention, similar to the 1948 to 1952 intervention of the Marshall Plan into Europe, is quite compelling. As was mentioned during the introduction, about 10 years ago, I wrote a book which was quite a damning critique of large-scale aid programs from developed nations and developed organizations, developing country focused organizations, to developing countries. And I won't go through the whole list of why I felt that fundamentally that those types of aid programs were unsustainable. But certainly the arguments about corruption, around inflation, around Dutch disease, which was undermining the local export sector, were just some of the points that I raised and I felt were critically important. However, I was very clear in not only that book 10 years ago, Dead Aid, but also more recently in the article that I published in The Economist magazine about the need for a Marshall Plan, that we are in particular circumstances where the evidence has shown, not just because of the Marshall Plan, but more generally, that there is an important imperative for large countries to think about putting together some kind of relief package for Africa. Let me start by just giving a little bit more context to the Marshall Plan. It was a plan between 1948 and 1952. It was designed to basically support reconstruction of Europe in the post-war era. It was approximately $135 billion in today's money. And so just in terms of the specific what I think is very appealing in the African context is that it was short, it was finite, and it was very sharply targeted. And I suspect one of my other colleagues on this call will be able to talk a little bit more about how expansive that approach was. But nevertheless, I think there are three reasons in particular why it is important for us to reconsider, without getting so focused on labels of a Marshall Plan, why it's important for us to think about a new program of intervention into the African continent. The first point is a health imperative. According to the World Health Organization, emerging market countries, but in general, in poor places, in wealthy countries, we should be spending on average around $34 to $40 per person per year. Many African countries, and it's not just an African problem, but around the world, even in poor areas of developed countries, the amount of money spent on healthcare is falling far below that number. So just in terms of capital infusion to support the health sector, it seems to me that some form of Marshall Plan is quite compelling. The second point is an economic one. I strongly believe we have not yet started to see the full impact and second order effects of what a healthcare tragedy in the pandemic what costs us will be unleashed on the economic sector. We have already seen the IMF call for their expectation of a minus 5.9% decline in the economy. The truth is, even before the pandemic hit, the global economy was in an era, heading towards an era of slow and low economic growth, with serious concerns around the impotence of public policy, both in terms of fiscal and monetary policy, serious concerns around the debt and deficits of countries, and perhaps most poignantly, given the opening remarks here, there were serious concerns around deglobalization. So the notion that we should be thinking about more trade in Africa, it feels a little bit late to be banging on about that at a time when whether it's trade, whether capital flows, whether it's immigration to movement of people across borders, or indeed even just the movement of ideas, the global idea of globalization has been under threat. So suffice it to say, economically, African countries, not just African countries, around the world, countries are vulnerable to a depression-like scenario. The third point that I make, aside from healthcare and economic arguments, to me, the most important point in terms of urgency from the Western standpoint is relevance. There is a geopolitical tug of war going on. We know about this. It's been going on for over a decade now between the West and China. And China, by far, whether it's in foreign direct investment, whether it's in trade, whether it's in the ownership of debt, their infrastructure programs through the BRICS banks and the Belt and Road, China has made considerable inroads to such an extent that today China is the biggest lender, not just to the US government as a foreign lender to the US government, but it is also the biggest lender in terms of debt to the emerging markets, surpassing many other agencies. So in summation, really, we need some kind of a package, not just to support healthcare in this very tumultuous times, and not just to support economics, but we absolutely need, if there is to be an ideological argument coming from the West will need to stamp its imprimatur in the emerging markets in general, but in Africa specifically. Otherwise, the ideological debate between democratic market capitalist states versus state capitalist states that deprioritize democracy, such as China, is essentially already lost to the West if they can't even be bothered to compete at this time. I will close by just saying, to some, this whole idea of a Marshall Plan, asking for at least $1 trillion to pursue some kind of package for health, economics, and geopolitical stability may seem fanciful. After all, Western countries are themselves struggling under a heap of debt and massive deficits that are to a large part seen as unsustainable. And of course, the low growth scenario that I mentioned earlier, and a lot of other aspects that are eroding their own economies. But I do think it is important that this debate in a sensible way is brought back to the table if we are to address the multitude of challenges, economic, geopolitical, social, and environmental, that the global economy is likely to face in the next decade and onwards. So
Brilliant.
I will stop there. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Dambisa. That was excellent. Aubrey, Dambisa has spelled out the 3 imperatives for Marshall Plan-like initiative. Can you also give us, in a few minutes, the imperative from your perspective? Over to you, please.
Thank you, Gabriel. Pleasure to be on this esteemed panel. So I, first of all, agree that with Dambisa about skepticism around aid. I have lived my whole career in that realm. I don't believe a lot of the aid projects have achieved the goals. And so, yes, I have a deep skepticism. But I've also had a lifetime inspiration by the Marshall Plan. I can really look to it as, I think, one of the greatest examples of enlightened self-interest and learning from history. And that we didn't want Germany to pay reparations again, which led, between the interwar period to World War II. But there's been many calls for the Marshall Plan over the last 4 decades for Africa. And I think the issue there is that people don't tend to understand the structure of the Marshall Plan, which actually made it work. And for those of us on this call and on this panel who've done a lot of business in African markets, you all know that execution is everything. And so if you can't execute something in a meaningful way, then this aid could go down the same path as the aid before. And so for me, really, there are 5 elements of the Marshall Plan that need to be considered in any discussion around a big aid push for African markets. The first was that there was a focus on productivity. The Marshall Plan was in part an effort to restore European productivity. And we know there's been a ton of work done by CGD and others on African firm level productivity. And we know at both a farm and firm level that African productivity is much lower per worker than it is in Asia, for example. And so this question of how you design a program focused on productivity, particularly industrial productivity, is very important. We know African markets today are less industrial than they were in 1980. So there's a deindustrialization taking place, and any intervention needs to address productivity at the core. Secondly, the Marshall Plan had a conditionality of integration. So economic integration was core to the Marshall Plan effort. The first customs union really came to be in Europe as a result of the Marshall Plan really coming to fruition in 1950. And so getting the European countries that decided to participate, because remember the Marshall Plan was offered to Russia and Eastern European countries, but those that decided to participate had to come up with joint plans. That's where you had European Steel and Coal Community. So you literally had a conditionality of integration. The third element that is very important was that there was a huge mobilization of private sector expertise. So in that effort to increase productivity, hundreds of experts from high levels of the Ford Motor Company to John Deere to all very large industrial US companies spent time in Europe. There was exchanges back and forth. There was actually a chunk of money allotted, $5 million, where at the time to bring 350 experts to Europe from the US and 480 to, vice versa, 350 to Europe and then 480 to the US to study and to really get these areas of productivity. You saw that also in Asia when you look at the Japanese and the Korean transformation and the US role in those transformations. There was also a focus on Forex. Most European countries, because they had no more export capacity, were not earning Forex. And that is the same case that you see today in many African countries. Right now, Nigeria has a shortage of Forex. Ethiopia has a shortage because exports aren't happening. And those that were dependent on oil exports obviously are getting less per barrel. So this restriction on Forex obviously hampers productivity because you cannot import inputs. So there was an element of getting dollars in the hands of European companies so that they could rebuild their productivity. That piece would be very key in a future Marshall Plan for Africa if we were to move forward. And lastly, the Marshall Plan reinforced democratic structures. So loans were given directly to companies in Europe as a product of the Marshall Plan. And those loans were then paid back to European governments in the form of taxes. So you actually increased the tax base during that time. We know that African countries, particularly the oil-dependent ones, have a very, very low tax base relative to their GDP. So any kind of direct transfers to Africans, as Dambisa called for in her article, would need to be also paid back and increasing the tax base. So I think thinking about the actual structures of what made the Marshall Plan a unique success when it comes to global aid are very important in considering any future big push of aid towards African markets. The last thing I would say is that to discuss something meaningful, it has to be feasible. And I think people misunderstand or don't understand the lack of the effort that was put in to sell the Marshall Plan to the American people. Between August and November 1947, over 200 members of Congress visited Europe on fact-finding missions. So almost half of the US Congress spent time in the region understanding the issues on the ground. And that created an incredible level of real expertise, direct experience, and it brought a buy-in from Congress that translated in part to buy-in from the American people. So by the beginning of 1948, over 2/3 of Americans had heard about the Marshall Plan, and there was a PR effort at the time called A Marshall Plan for the Marshall Plan. because there was such a view that there needed to be buy-in. And anything at $1 trillion that will go external to the United States or from European countries would need that level of buy-in, because we know as a fact that Americans don't have any sense of the real amount of aid that we give. So, thinking about execution is very important at this point. And so I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
I've been one that to critique calls for Marshall Plans in the past, because I think they just overlook the structures that made it work. And unfortunately, without those structures, we would go down the same path of the aid that Dambisa criticized in Debt Aid. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Gabriel.
Thank you. Thank you, Aubrey, and for the imperatives you've laid out. And I think we'll have a chance to come back to them. Let me now come back to Congressman Dave. Dave, from where you sit or where you've been sitting in this age of America First and Brexit and what have you, how do you see this whole call for master plan being a Marshall Plan being played out? Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me with you today. I agree with the comments. They did all the heavy lifting. The first two panelists did a great job setting it up. I'll just make some remarks as a former congressman that I think I followed Danny Roderick and his work on bottlenecks at the World Bank. My mind kind of thinks that way. I followed Doug North on institutions. And so when I think about the Marshall Plan, I go back to the broader liberal Bretton Woods order we set up after World War II. And we did that, and I always make reference to this in contrast to China with our arch enemies, right? The Judeo-Christian tradition is probably a part of that momentum. And so we made friends with our arch enemies, the Japanese and the Germans, and we made hard moves and said, okay, let's work together, but you're going to have to redo your politics with major implications to power bases in your own country. Going forward, and in addition to their European, economic setup. And so why is that important? We're kind of at a unique historic moment right now, ironically, with President Trump in office tearing down the establishment on my Republican side and the Democrat side. And so what's this have to do with African development? Well, over 30 or 40 years, I taught economics and development economics and growth economics for 20 years. What are the bottlenecks? What are the impediments? And the answer is it's the politics. And corruption, right? Political corruption, setting up the institutions you need to be successful so that you can accumulate capital. Capital is second order. You got to first have political stability before capital wants to move anywhere. And so it's kind of ironic that, the World Bank by its charter is not supposed to touch political variables, right? I did cross-country regressions for 20 years, and you couldn't I put them in, and the T-stats blew off the roof. But the bank's not allowed to put political variables in there. They don't want to get hot. They don't want to get in those discussions, and you can't deal with religion. Well, last time I checked, when you read the broad swath of human history, those are the two most powerful forces that exist, and if you don't have a revolution from below, nothing's going to work out. And so right now we're at a unique moment where everyone realizes China's the elephant in the room. They do not share any of those shared values across this Bretton Woods modern liberal order. And so it's crucial that the African countries make a commitment to tear down their corruption. And that means going after your friends and the billionaires in those countries, right? So I think the UN did a study over 1.4 trillion dollars in illicit funds have been sent abroad from Africa. So there's a huge chunk of funding right there to make this thing take off. And then on the U.S. side, we just had the pandemic, and we're still, spiking in various areas. And we have we're increasing aggregate demand through, just the government spending. And we found out in the last few days, some of that money has flowed to Chinese CCP firms, right? Our own aid through our elites and our billionaire class that props up China because they've been growing for 10%. So both sides have to come clean, and we've got to get rid of the old order. And when we say America first over here, it doesn't mean we don't want to link up with the rest of the world. We want to make friends with all countries. And I think the U.S. has a better track record on that order than China does. And so, getting down to brass tacks, my friend Jonas Biru, economist, World Bank economist, a good friend of mine, he's been writing for a while, and he's got a few solutions on how do you fund this. And that the first is to get at that illicit funding, and then the second is to give some tax breaks to bring the supply chains back to the U.S. and the African countries are a natural ally there for that shift. And then thirdly, he notes we can do some venture capital funds and put some funds together with the African diaspora. So there are ways to make this happen financially, which is the hard part. But for me, the crux of it is the African countries have to make it very clear what they're going to do on the corruption front so that capital can flow. If you're going to have a private sector initiative, capital's not flowing anywhere, right? At the individual level, at the firm level, same thing, same logic operates at the national level. You got to have an attractive home base for that capital flight. And then in the U.S., we've got to do our part so that we make friends with the right countries. And I think Sub-Saharan Africa and the Horn of Africa are natural friends and allies. And so I'll just end my comments right there. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. It's a politics, and that's a very good springboard. Let me now, the questions are coming in, so I'm going to try and summarize a few. So Dambisa, let me throw the first one at you. One of the key lessons that we've taken from the Marshall Plan is not so much the size of the envelope, as it were, but the types of reform and cooperation that ensued. And I've also been reading Jonas Biru, a prominent economist from the World Bank, and one of his biggest suggestions is that, yes, we need a Marshall Plan, but strongly underpinned by strong governance reforms. So, Dambisa, given that there has not been enough reforms in governance and institution building and so on, how do you then propose such a massive type of aid and the direct cash scheme that you've proposed without the concomitant reforms in institutions and governance? Over to you, Dambisa.
So thank you. One of my great frustrations is I turned 50 years old last year, and for some reason, the narrative and discussion around the African continent is just not changing. We always talk about corruption, we talk about poverty, we talk about war, we talk about disease, the lack of institutions, and it's deeply frustrating to me that we seem to be repeating ourselves year in, year out, generations that came before me, and clearly we're not moving the needle aggressively enough to change the narrative for generations that are coming after. To answer your question specifically, I'm an eternal optimist that technology actually is one route that will allow us to circumvent some of the trauma and the sort of second order dead weight losses that we've seen by relying on institutions and political machinations that David alluded to, that perhaps have created these negative outcomes in the past. So in my article, again, in The Economist, I talk about remittances and new ways of transferring capital. My view is you have to be optimistic that that there are new patterns, new opportunities for innovation in much the same way that we're innovating how we eat, how we travel, how we communicate. It just cannot be same regarding the interaction and engagement where Africa is concerned. If it were that, I would be back to my original book to say that these types of programs will be long-term undermining for human progress and living standards. But really, what I'm driving towards is that we are living in a new era of greater deglobalization, larger government responsibility, more important government as an arbiter of capital and labor, private sector shrinking, private sector becoming much more concentrated. And to me, that world is much more akin to a world where you'll see much more scope for innovation to circumvent some of those barriers. And the concept of aid, or certainly transfers to support healthcare, education, and ultimately to keep the West in particular competitive geopolitically, seems to me to be ripe for much more technological engagement and import. So that's how I'm thinking about those types of institutional hurdles.
Good,
And,
good.
and
Thank
Gabriel,
you. Yeah,
maybe I can jump in there as well.
please come in. Yeah.
Because I too, I mean, Dambisa and I maybe share a same birthday year of some sort. I turned 40 last year, and also am frustrated by the constant focus on corruption in any conversation on Africa, because while she may take an optimistic view, I take a historical one. And let's remember that the United States, for at least 120 years, the most requested presidential appointment was head of Customs House, New York, because of the ability to skim off. And our, Gilded Age was defined by corruption. And look at the number of mayors in America today who are in jail for, local level corruption. The difference is that there's a tension between the business community and the political establishment that makes for better governance. And so you have an option if you want to be influential, wealthy, successful. You do not have to always be a minister or a cabinet secretary in the United States or developed countries. You can be in business your whole life. We need more Dangotes in African markets. There are only 400 companies that do over $1 billion US revenue a year in the region. That's a problem because there's not enough of a tension between the business community and government that makes for better government over time as they check each other. And so a Marshall Plan, the way it was designed originally, it shored up the business community in Europe. And that was a very important aspect of it. In fact, even in the United States, there was a committee for the passage of the Marshall Plan that had over 300 members that included business leaders, generals, religious leaders, academics, et cetera, a whole broad swath of society, which it also increased democratic participation. So I actually think you need the capital, you need the business activity before you get good governance. And I think the history of European countries and US shows that. So I guess I disagree with Dr. Bratt on making it a prerequisite from day one to have better institutions before investment comes. I think the investment comes and in that process makes better institutions.
Okay, let me stay on Aubrey because...
Let me go on that one for 1 second.
Okay, Dave. Yeah, very quickly, please.
I just want to offer a word of caution on the technological hopes. Because when you talk about the Gilded Age, we got a second Gilded Age right now. It's in the United States right now, and it's in the technology sphere. 6 firms are driving our entire stock market. So in economics, you have perfect competition. That means there's a lot of firms competing. We have total monopolies in the US right now. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, right down the line. The big press is all, Washington Post is owned by Amazon. And that's why you're going to have a hard time. So we've got income inequality over here, but no one wants to really address the billionaire class, right? People are going after the wrong variables. And so when you want to make a deal with the US right now, you're right, you can be rich in business here. They own the politicians. I was in Congress, right? I was on the budget committee and they told us what was in the budget at the beginning of the year before we started doing our work, just to give you a hint at how corrupt it is over here. All the money are tied to special crony capitalist deals with lobbyists up in DC. And that includes relationships with Africa. And so if you're going to get Africa in play, you got some heavy lifting to do over here because right now people care more about investing in China because they've had 10% growth rates. And our firms are just schizophrenic, right? We got Larry Fink with BlackRock doing ESG liberal investing over here on the environment and liberal social justice. And they tells his folks to put half your money in China, who's not known for their clear skies and human rights track record. So that's what I'm just trying to tell folks what the constraints really are. But you need to go after our billionaire class and get them to be friends of Africa. They control our politicians. It's not vice versa.
Good. Dambisa, before you come in, though, could you also address the issue of not only corruption here, but the issue of institutions and rules that ensure accountability of this type of massive aid? But go ahead, Dambisa.
Yeah, so I think I kind of touched on the second point already, that clearly institutions have failed us in large part, and I think it's very apropos that both my colleagues are referring to the Gilded Age. They are right that the period from 1870 to the early 1900s in the United States there are many characteristics of that period that we see today: income inequality, the issue of concentration of and essentially monopolies and oligopolies in not just the technology sector, but also in pharmaceuticals, banking, energy companies, mining companies, et cetera, and indeed even with institutional investors. You mentioned BlackRock, but there are others as well. And so, yes, there is that point to be made about the sort of history repeating itself. I would just caution about sort of handing it off. And my question and my intervention, really, where Dr. Bratt was concerned, was to say you were there, you were in the coalface of government. I mean, you say we should go after the billionaires, which is completely antithetical to the American sense of the American dream and capitalism, which is a sort of a more ideological debate. But what is it that, I don't mean to be sort of poignant, and I'm not pointing at you specifically, but what is going on in the US government, the political class, that is actually going to reform some of these things? I mean, we hear about antitrust legislation, very much similar to the Sherman Act, coming back with a vengeance, starting just this month when there'll be debates with the tech leaders. But I just think it's easy to pass it. Somebody is going to blame someone else all the time. And this maybe fundamentally, last point, is why I think that Africa's growth narrative has to emerge despite or in spite of institutions. And I think there's a real opportunity for technology to provide that. Unlike Dr. Bratt, I'm not of the view that it's only because of these 4 companies that the stock market is up. We've had a massive stimulus program. Most of the people who are participating in this upside are actually not institutional investors, they're retail investors. And so the notion that we can actually quickly pinpoint who's at fault here. My central view is that the government sets up the state, sets up the environment in terms of infrastructure, in terms of education. We are failing, not just in Africa, but also in the United States, in terms of being forward-leaning, in terms of being data-driven, measured outcomes, in terms of being serious about being competitive. It's not just an African problem. It's also clearly the problem in the United States.
Okay, Dave, let me come to you, but let me also pose another question, and then I'll ask you to respond. You've raised China in your opening statement, and we'd be remiss if we did not discuss China a bit here.
Yeah.
The U.S. clearly has shown a fervent desire to retreat from multilateralism by withdrawing from international treaties and international organizations. Of course, most recently, the WHO. By doing so, the US is in effect relinquishing its leadership in global governance. Meanwhile, China is stepping up and increasing its activity internationally and is promoting influential initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, a new Marshall Plan of sorts from China. Now, given the threat that we all understand China poses to the U.S., how eager or how ready is the U.S. to counter the Belt and Road Initiative with a master plan, with a Marshall Plan for Africa? Because without it, then China will probably take the lead on this. So could you answer that?
Yeah, and so the retreat from multilateralism doesn't mean we're not going to be invested in the world still. I think it's just going to be in a different way, and it's going to be more reliant on the Marshall Plan logic of using markets and those relationships. And so, in Europe, you can look at Chinese Huawei, right? Every firm China has, first of all, isn't audited in any way, shape, or form. And Huawei, any firm has a contractual basis where all the information flows back to the CCP, right, the Communist Party. And so when Europe is going that route, right, to get free infrastructure because they're in trouble, we have grave reservations about that. Thank goodness this COVID has exposed China and these relationships. And so now I think we're making friends by the day, right? Australia was teetering. We're good with them. India now is a tough ally with us. So it's not like we're not making friends. And Secretary Pompeo has made strong initiatives into Africa on several fronts that are, in the $1 billion range. So we don't want to step back. I think everybody, sub-Saharan African leaders are seeing what China is really like after you start doing business with them, and they are very upset with China now as well, especially after the coronavirus. And so the U.S. is going to be the key in terms of a Marshall Plan, and it is key that we do sell the American people on that. And there's very good rationale, right? Setting up the strategic initiatives for our own security is number one that Jonas Biru, points out in his work. And China, I don't want to keep beating the same dead horse, but Joe Biden, when he's VP, flew over and his kid got $1 billion deal. And so when I'm saying our politicians are bought off, they are bought off by China. So why isn't our governance doing anything? I was one of the few free market guys. My own party gave me nothing because I actually voted my free market principles, that I didn't want the state running everything. So we got some uphill work to do to get a Marshall Plan going for Africa.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Aubrey, let me swing back to you. In her opening remark, Dambisa pointed out that Vera Songwe, the head of the UNECA, had referred to the CFTA as the African version of the Marshall Plan. And you've recently interviewed the CFTA Secretary General and have written on this subject. How do you react to Vera's comments on how could the United States be supporting the CFTA? Is that indeed an alternative or a complement to a possible Marshall Plan initiative?
Thanks, Gabriel. First, to as Dambisa said, I wish Vera was on this panel.
Sure.
I have great esteem for her. She tweeted that like 2 years ago. So I think that, her tweet is taken a little bit out of context in many ways. But listen, the view that free trade within the region can be a driver of economic recovery is an important one. And I think the Secretary General holds that view, as does many African leaders, because the idea of global trade coming back anytime soon at the magnitude and volume that it was at is just not a reality. So, the only way is to unleash new opportunities through trade that was kind of pent up. And to find areas of economic growth that were a result of inefficiency. So, we know that the region as a whole is going to have its first recession in 25 years. It varies enormously. Nigeria is probably contracting at somewhere around 4% right now is the estimate, whereas Kenya still can continue to grow at slightly under 1%. But it does mean that people are getting poorer every day. Unemployment is growing. The informal sector is growing. And because of that, you need to address inefficiencies. And one of the inefficiencies happens to be that there are 54 borders to cross and regulatory frameworks to navigate in very, very small markets. So unleashing the power of the larger market will stimulate economic growth, as well as things that happen in the kind of trade facilitation realm. So digitizing customs, digitizing borders, those type of things can stimulate economic growth. I don't like to use the term Marshall Plan because the Marshall Plan was a very specific thing. Even like when you talk about Belt and Road, it's not a Marshall Plan. That is the Chinese government basically doing support of its own companies, doing projects abroad. It's not creating productivity on the ground in African markets. It's not direct transfers to the African private sector. It's not focused on increasing African productivity. I mean, maybe some of the infrastructure built as a result will, but it's not, it shouldn't be called a Marshall Plan, nor should the African Continental Free Trade Agreement be called a Marshall Plan. It's fundamentally not one, but it is a driver of economic recovery.
Good.
Very good.
Thank you, Aubrey. Dambisa, let me swing to you. As Aubrey said, unleashing the productivity and efficiency gains of a larger market in the face of a contracting African economy. Do those two square off properly in your view?
Well, listen, so even before COVID hit, as I alluded to in my introductory remarks, we're already in a pretty tenuous position from the perspective of the global economy. Not only had we had multiple periods of low economic growth, but public policy, as I mentioned earlier, was already pretty impotent. We have developed countries that before COVID were in negative interest rate environments like Russia and Japan. We have countries like the United States that are not only, no matter what they say about China, the US government still has China as its number one foreign lender. So heavily integrated, heavily dependent on China. We had a situation where there was a multitude of headwinds that really not just Africa, but the global economy is ill prepared for, whether it's the risk of technology and the risk of a jobless underclass, demographic shifts. I mean, the population of the world is really rapidly increasing towards 11 billion people by 2100, according to the UN. India is adding 1 million people a month to its population. We had issues of income inequality. We've had 30 years in the United States where the social mobility has come down by 50%. That is completely antithetical and eroding the whole idea of an American dream. Climate change. We haven't even mentioned climate change and the consequences of climate change and how they got knock-on effects to disruptive and disorderly migration, which today stands at roughly 70 million people who are essentially dislocated or refugees, according to the International Rescue Commission. We have debt. I don't even need to get into that, but I will say the Congressional Budget Office has talked about the fact that by 2030, now 10 years away, we have a situation where the United States and many European countries will be unable to sustain their social programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. And then, of course, as Aubrey mentioned a moment ago, we have an issue of productivity. There's been a rapid decline in productivity to levels that are not, and for people who aren't economists, there are three drivers of growth: capital, labor, and productivity. By many estimates, productivity explains up to 60% of why one country grows and another one does not. So if you have problems with productivity, which we have seen not just in Africa, but across the world, then we really have a long-term scenario where economic growth will continue to stall way below that 3% number, the 3% rule of 72, 3% magic number that you need to be growing at to double per capita incomes in a generation. So that is the backdrop we were facing before COVID-19. What COVID-19 has done is to accelerate a lot of these problems. And the best that we can expect from society is to really step in to try and mitigate the risk so that we don't end up with a situation where living standards are materially deteriorated and human progress is stalled, not just for the short term, but for the long term. How do we get that sorted? And to me, this idea of a Marshall Plan is really to act as a mitigant to some of the challenges that I've outlined here, which are very deep, very structural. And unfortunately, and I think Dr. Bratt was really getting into this point, that we have short-term cycles in public policy in terms of politics, which are undermining our ability to come up with long-term solutions, which are the ones that I just outlined, the deep structure problems in terms of education, in terms of healthcare infrastructure, that take multiple generations to solve. So this is a long-winded way of saying, I'm trying to solve for an immediate and urgent problem, recognizing that if we get off of base with an intervention today, it means that we are even further away from longer term solutions on the whole range of problems that I just announced and mentioned here a moment ago.
Okay, thank you, Dambisa. As we begin to wind down, let me just throw this out very broadly. In the face of this global environment we're in, or Africa is in, contracting economies and the impact of COVID, where are the points of hope? Where do we see optimism? What are the basis? Okay, we've talked about technology and trade and so on, but for the average African, where is the point of hope in the midst of all this? Dave, do you want to start?
Yeah, I like what Dambisa was just saying with respect to education. We've got an issue here, but the younger generation, the kids they actually like their parents for the first time in world history. That's a new variable. And they want to do good in the world. And so if you look at relationships like between the U.S. and Africa, there's going to be natural affinity going forward. We're global, right? The kids have technology at their fingertips. And I think what the positive note for Africa and us, but this requires a big shift because we got a lot of folks working against this, is that business is morally good, right? In my own tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition, for the first 1,000 years, it wasn't considered morally good. And so that it's just a simple piece. But if the African nations can reach out to us, right, we're having racial issues here. None of it needs to be. There's no upper bound on growth, right? There's no upper bound on the number of kids in our cities that can get rich. But you got to first say business is good. And so I think Africa can be a great partner with us in spreading that message. Not only is it good, we need it with you. We need to partner with you. We can all be children of God together. And there's my hope for the day.
Good. Okay, Aubrey, do you want to build on what you've said, a few of the points you've made?
Sure. So, I think there are several areas of optimism. I think some countries are not wasting this crisis and are addressing inefficiencies, long-held inefficiencies around digitization in particular, around dependence on cash. These high transaction cost elements, if they can be eliminated, then the economies that will come out of the COVID recession period will be more efficient and structured for growth long term. Also, I think there's a lot of opportunity for strong relationships on a people-to-people soft power level with the US, because I do think the kind of emergence of African creative sectors, whether that be Nigerian music that's gone global, whether it's Netflix doing shows produced by Africans, filmed in Africa, that kind of collaboration brings those people-to-people ties very strongly. And I think that's an asset we have that the Chinese don't necessarily have, and we should double down in that area. I'm optimistic about the new DFC. Because of the perceived competition with China, the global competition with China. We got the BUILD Act in October 2018, which greatly expanded OPIC, gave it new powers, expanded its lending capacity to $60 billion, and it really enhanced new tools. Likewise, we got US Exim Bank working again, which it was more bound for basically 8 years. So we really do have the tools in our toolbox to support U.S. companies to make new investments in the region. So, I'm optimistic about the potential there.
Excellent. Dambisa, points of optimism?
Yes, no, I'm an eternal optimist. I think that Aubrey's done a good job of picking up on some of the points I would make. I've talked about technology. I mean, technology has the opportunity not only to reduce the cost structure of food production, transportation, communication, but really to get at the heart of a lot of the public goods, the delivery of public goods that we've struggled with. So something like education, yes, there's some initial data that says this is much harder a task, but I really believe in areas of public policy and technology can help solve concerns around education and healthcare as a starter. So I remain very optimistic about the things that we have seen and perhaps not seen yet around technology. I'm not claiming it will be linear, and there are lots of, for every positive upside story, somebody I'm sure will rustle up something negative that needs to be mitigated and monitored. But I think fundamentally, this technology gives us an opportunity to circumvent a lot of the bottlenecks and challenges that institutions laden with bureaucracy and with corruption have halted. The other point I would just make is, and I think this is picking up on Aubrey's point again, I do think that this crisis will be a real opportunity to really reveal, as Warren Buffett says, those people who've been swimming naked. And in this particular context, I think it's about public policymakers that have not delivered in terms of quality and quantity of public goods. As I said, education, healthcare, infrastructure are now going to be taken to the test. There's simply, in a world where there's demand around social and cultural change, those countries, those politicians who will be back-footed, I think will now be ended and basically targeted for the history books. And in that respect, I remain very optimistic about what might come out of this crisis. Thank you.
Brilliant, brilliant. I think that's a very good note to end on, a point of optimism. As you said, the tide is down and we can see who's swimming naked and who's not. So that's a very good point to end on. Let me just, for my part, say thank you. Thank you to all three of you and our panelists, and to the people who've been sending in messages. Let me say thank you very much. And I'll hand it over to Bronwyn, who will now make a closing statement. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and particularly thank you to our panelists. That was an amazing conversation. It was so wide-ranging and comprehensive, and it added a tremendous amount of value and specificity to this discussion of the Marshall Plan. From my perspective, I really think there's only one thing that we didn't tackle in our conversation, and that is, frankly, amidst all of the references to monopolies and the golden age and the self-interest that underlay the original Marshall Plan, we haven't talked about American business, and specifically their lack of interest in Africa, the lack of conviction that they have that Africa is essential to their bottom lines, or will be in the future. And that, in my mind, is fundamentally the difference between China and the United States. China gets it. China knows that it needs Africa to succeed. And if American businesses believed that, we would have a Marshall Plan. Because, as Dr. David Broad was saying, it's not the American people who set policy. It's not politicians who set policy. It's businesses and their lobbyists who set policy in this country. So if we can persuade them, and Aubrey referenced the DFC, the new Development Finance Corporation, through that vehicle or others, that American businesses can succeed in Africa, I think there's nothing that we can't accomplish. A final note. Vera Songwe has been summoned so much in this conversation, and the Africa Center is scheduled to tape an interview with her as soon as the internet comes back on in Ethiopia. We will ask Vera to comment on her comments on the Marshall Plan, and we will be sure to tweet out her update. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Gabriel Nagatu, for your masterful moderation of this talk. We'll look forward to seeing you again. Have a great day.
Thank you.